snow fell hard tonight. He forced her out, mother and newborn, abandoned at the door. Neighbors turned away. The sheriff came knocking, and her child's tiny fist clutched what no one expected. A ledger of names, secrets, and codes powerful men would kill to protect. Each step into the storm carried not just survival, but the weight of truth hidden in the baby's hands. Before dawn, she must decide, keep running or expose everything and bring down the very men who try to erase her. What would you do in her place? Before we continue with this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel, as we have a special story that'll be released soon. The door slammed with a finality that seemed to echo longer than it should have, rattling the frame and sealing itself against her as though the house itself wanted no memory of her inside. She stood there for a moment on the stoop, stunned, her breath fogging in the brittle air, the weight of her baby heavy against her chest. The latch clicked, sharp and decisive, the kind of sound that leaves no room for return. She turned, pressing her back against the closed door, and felt the shock of the wood cold through her coat. A dusting of snow was already gathering on her shoulders, flakes catching in her hair, melting quickly before turning to damp patches that seeped into the fabric. She pulled the thin blanket tighter around the infant in her arms, rocking gently, though not even she could hear the lull of her own motion over the gusting wind. The baby stirred but did not cry, as though even at such a tender age it could feel the strangeness of the moment. The way silence pressed down heavier than any storm, broken only by the rasp of branches clawing at the house. She dared not knock, dared not plead. His voice was still in her ears, sharp as glass, each word cutting deep, telling her to leave, telling her there was no place for her under his roof anymore. And now here she was, standing in the threshold of rejection, snow rising at her feet like a tide she hadn't seen coming. The street was empty. A few houses stood with their curtains pulled shut, a glow here and there from lamps or television screens. She knew behind those walls people might have heard the shouting, the slam of the door, might even be standing now with hands resting on windowsills, but no one opened the door. No one called out. In small towns, silence was sometimes louder than confrontation. They had seen enough over the months, enough to turn away when the storm finally broke in the open. Her cheeks burned, though the cold gnawed at her skin, each gust stinging as though the night itself were punishing her. She adjusted her hold on the baby, shifting its weight to her other arm, feeling the child's warmth seep through layers of wool and cotton, the only warmth she had. She thought briefly of pounding the door, of shouting his name, until the neighbors could not pretend anymore, until someone was forced to intervene. But something inside her clenched tighter than fear, something that whispered of dignity, of finality. He had forced her out, and she would not beg for the scraps of the life he had already stripped away. The snow fell harder, fast and dry, the kind that clung to eyelashes and melted into eyes until they stung with water that could be mistaken for tears. She took a step down from the stoop, boots crunching into the whiteness that had already begun to mound against the walkway. Another step, and the house loomed behind her like a shadow, indifferent, unwelcoming. She did not turn back. Each breath burned her lungs, but she kept moving forward, the baby shifting slightly, a small sound muffled against her chest. She kissed the top of its head, a whispered apology dissolving in the storm. The cold door was behind her now, and ahead was only snow, the kind that swallows paths and covers all evidence that anyone had passed this way at all. She tightened her grip and walked into it, carrying everything she had left. The wind cut across the street like a blade, shrieking around the corners of houses and slipping easily through the thin seams of her coat. She bent her head, tried to shield her baby's face from the sting of snowflakes that bit like salt on raw skin. The child whimpered at first, a soft sound that trembled against her collarbone, and then the whimper stretched into a cry. Thin, sharp, and desperate, she pulled her coat tighter, folding the edges around the small bundle, pressing the child closer to her chest as though her own heartbeat could muffle the sound, as though warmth alone could soothe what neither of them could control. The cry grew louder in the emptiness of night, rising above the hiss of snow skimming across the ground. She glanced toward the houses on either side of the street, their porches dark, their curtains drawn tight. No doors opened, no faces appeared. Yet she couldn't shake the feeling that ears were listening, that someone, somewhere behind the safety of glass and curtains, heard her baby's voice piercing through the storm. The sound carried too far in such silence, a beacon she had no way to extinguish. Her arms ached, not from the weight, but from the sheer desperation of holding so tight, as if she could hide the child from the world's cruelty simply by pressing him against her. The little hands, half exposed, reached upward and grasped at the edge of her collar, tiny fingers curling instinctively, clutching as though the infant too understood the danger of being outside in the dark with nowhere to go. She pressed a kiss into the damp curls of hair, her lips trembling against the child's head, and whispered promises she wasn't sure she could keep. It's all right, Mama's here." The words cracked in her throat, thin against the howl of the wind. The baby's cries sharpened, the small body squirming against her chest, protesting the cold and the hunger both. She shifted her stance, bouncing slightly the way mothers do without thought, rocking and swaying as though motion itself could persuade the child to settle. Her own body shook beneath the effort, exhaustion already clawing at her after hours of tension, but she kept moving. If the baby cried too long, too loud, she feared more than just the storm would take notice. Snow settled on her eyelashes, melting into her eyes until her vision blurred. She blinked hard and kept walking, feeling her boots sink into drifts that grew deeper with each block. The child's cries echoed in her head, filling her chest with a throb of helplessness that no rocking could ease. She thought of the warmth she had left behind, the fire, the blankets, the roof under which her child should have been sleeping. He had thrown them both into the night as though they were burdens, not family, and now the baby's voice, shrill with need, was proof of what had been lost. She adjusted her coat once more, pulling the wool higher, pressing the edges until the baby's face was buried against her, shielded from the wind. The cry soft and muffled, though the sound vibrated still against her chest. She felt it as much as she heard it, a trembling note that would not release her no matter how tightly she held. And with every step, she carried not only her child to the storm, but the echo of that cry, something raw and unrelenting, something that reminded her with each breath that she had nowhere to go, and yet she had no choice but to keep going. His voice lingered in her ears long after the door had closed, words as sharp as the winter air cutting into her lungs. She could still hear the cadence, the clipped edges that left no space for hope or misinterpretation. He had spoken with the finality of a man chiseling letters into stone, and those words were now carved into her. They echoed louder than the baby's cries, louder than the storm itself, reverberating in her chest until she felt hollow. There was no plea hidden in his tone, no hesitation that might suggest regret. It was command, dismissal, and judgment all tangled together in a way she had never imagined she would hear from the man she once trusted with her whole life. She shifted her weight on the snowy path, tightening her hold on the baby, and stared at the door she had just been cast out from. Behind it, warmth glowed faintly through the curtains, the shadow of comfort she had known and fought to preserve. Yet his words had barred her from it forever. "You're nothing to me now." That was the line that replayed most vividly, striking her harder than the slam of the door. Nothing, not a wife, not the mother of his child, not a partner who had once shared in the building of their life together. Just nothing. The snow whipped around her, flakes catching in her hair, clinging to the edges of the blanket where her baby's face pressed for warmth. She bent her head, and for a moment she thought of turning back, of hammering her fist against the wood until it split, demanding he take the words back. But even as the thought flared, the memory of his expression froze her where she stood. Cold, flat, untouched by pity. A face carved out of stone, harder than the frost beneath her boots. There would be no undoing what had been spoken. She could almost hear the silence that followed after he threw her out, as though he had returned to his chair, settled back into his world, and erased her presence with a single breath. The sting of it burned more than the cold in her fingers. Years of sacrifice, of endurance, of standing beside him when others would have walked away, and all of it had dissolved into those few sentences. Final, unbending. The baby shifted, small hand pressing against her chest, and she exhaled a breath that trembled on the edge of breaking. She tried to push his voice out, to cover it with softer sounds, whispering promises to her child, telling herself that she could find a way forward. But the words clung stubbornly, louder than the wind. She feared they would haunt every step she took from here on, repeating themselves in the hollows of her mind, convincing her that perhaps he was right, that perhaps she really was nothing. She closed her eyes tightly, let the snow sting her lashes, and forced her legs to move. His final words might echo inside her, but they would not root her to the stoop. She had been cast out, and there was no more looking back. With each crunch of snow beneath her boots, she told herself the echo would grow quieter, but she knew, deep down, that it would never truly disappear. It would follow her like a shadow, sharper than the wind, a wound carved not on skin, but into memory itself. The street stretched out before her in a hush so deep it felt unnatural, the kind of quiet that pressed against the ears and made every small sound too loud. Her boots broke through the snow with sharp crunches, each step echoing against the facades of darkened houses. The baby's faint whimper carried with it a trembling note that seemed to seep into every doorway she passed. Curtains shifted here and there, just enough to betray the watching eyes behind them. A sliver of lamplight would blink open and close again, the faintest ripple in the dark, and then vanish as quickly as it had appeared. No one came out, not a single door unlatched. Not one voice called to her, asking if she was all right, asking if the child needed warmth. They knew enough already. In small towns, arguments did not remain hidden. Voices traveled through thin walls, and anger spilled easily into the street. They had heard him, his rage, his verdict, the door slamming with violence enough to rattle the frame. And they had seen her now, coat pulled too tight around a shivering bundle, snow dusting her hair, her cheeks raw with wind. Still they stayed behind glass, clinging to the safety of distance. She felt their eyes and the weight of their silence pressing against her back. It was not indifference, not entirely. It was fear, the kind that creeps into people when they sense trouble too heavy for them to carry. Everyone in this town understood what it meant to be on the wrong side of a man's pride. They measured risks carefully, and stepping onto the porch to help her might cost them more than they were willing to pay. So they stayed where they were, hidden behind lace curtains and drawn blinds, pretending the storm was reason enough to keep their doors shut. Her breath caught in her throat as she passed the old Miller house, its porch light glowing faintly yellow, the figure of Mrs. Miller a clear silhouette against the window. For a moment, she thought the door might open, that the older woman might call her in, offer a quilt, a cup of tea, a cradle for the child. But the curtain fell back into place, quick and decisive, and the light seemed colder than before. The ache that spread through her chest was heavier than the wind's bite. It wasn't just her husband who had shut her out. It was everyone. The baby stirred again, letting out a thin cry, and she bounced gently as she walked, murmuring words that dissolved on the air before even reaching her own ears. She tightened the coat once more, pressing the child closer, as though she could shield both of them not just from the snow, but from the eyes that refused to see them. The silence became almost unbearable, the kind that makes you doubt your own presence, as if the world had decided to erase you while still forcing you to walk through it. Ahead, the street narrowed where the snow had piled higher, and the lamplight thinned into shadow. She felt herself leaving the boundaries of safety, such as they were, and entering a stretch where no eyes watched, where no curtains shifted. The houses behind her closed their doors tighter, their windows dimmed, as if wiping their hands of her. It was a street she had walked many times before, but never had it seemed so foreign, so empty of mercy. She kept walking, the child's cries soft against her chest, knowing the only sound left to guide her was the rhythm of her own steps in the snow. The snow swallowed her footsteps as if eager to erase her from the world, each press of her boot sinking deep into the fresh powder. The sound was steady, rhythmic, and yet it carried no comfort, only the reminder how far she was from warmth, from welcome, from any certainty at all. Each step left behind a hollow imprint, quickly softened by the falling flakes, as though the storm itself wished to deny that she and her child had ever passed through. She pulled the baby closer, feeling the small weight press against her chest, the rise and fall of tiny breaths muffled beneath the layers of cloth. The night seemed endless, the kind of dark that bends the horizon out of sight, where street lamps gave out too quickly and the shadows between houses stretched long. She told herself to keep moving, to not let her body pause even for a second, because if she stopped, she feared she might never start again. The cold was an enemy she could not fight, only endure, and her steps became a kind of defiance, a silent refusal to collapse. The child whimpered, shifting slightly, and she adjusted her arms without breaking stride, whispering low promises into the night, words more for her own survival than the baby's understanding. Her mind wandered as she walked, back to mornings when the same street had felt familiar. She remembered the sound of children's laughter drifting from porches in the spring, the way summer sunlight bounced off white fences, the smell of wood smoke in autumn when neighbors raked leaves and waved from their yards. That life seemed impossibly distant now, as though she had stepped into some mirror image of her own town where all those memories had been stripped away. Now there was only the crunch of her boots and the storm swallowing her voice whenever she tried to hum a tune to soothe her baby. She caught herself counting her steps, perhaps to stay tethered to something measurable. 10, 20, 30, each one marked by the faint ache creeping up her legs and the weight of the child that grew heavier the longer she carried him. Her arms trembled now and again, but she refused to loosen her grip. She pressed her lips to the baby's forehead, tasting the dampness of melted snow, and kept walking, as though the act of moving forward might be enough to carve a path toward hope. The silence around her was immense, the kind of silence that carried weight. It settled over rooftops, over bare branches, over the empty road, a silence so complete that even her breathing seemed too loud. She felt as though she were trespassing in a place not meant for the living, where snow had claimed all sound and left only stillness behind. Yet beneath it all, she knew her own steps marked the truth. She was still here, still moving, still carrying something precious through the dark. The storm thickened, flakes spinning faster, stinging her cheeks. Her coat pulled tight. She bent her head against the wind and pressed onward, each step a small act of endurance. She could not see far ahead, but the rhythm of her movement was enough to push her forward. One sinking imprint after another, a trail the snow hurried to erase. The night wanted her gone, but she refused to vanish, and so she walked, holding her baby close, leaving behind a path that might disappear by morning but proved, for now, that she had not yet surrendered. She noticed at first as a flicker of reflected light, a glint breaking through the soft white haze of falling snow. At first she thought it was the frost on her baby's blanket, or perhaps the shine of a button catching what little glow spilled from the last street lamp. But as she shifted the child higher against her shoulder, the glint flashed again, unmistakable. She pulled the blanket back just enough to see the baby's tiny fist clenched tight, knuckles pale, clutching something small. It was wrapped in cloth, edges frayed, but there was metal beneath, the dull gleam of something not meant to be in a child's hand. For a moment, she stopped walking, the world stilling around her, except for the snow that whispered as it fell. She stared at the object, bewildered. She hadn't given the baby anything to hold when she'd left the house. No, when she'd been driven out. Her arms had been too full of desperation to gather more than the child and a blanket. Nothing else had been taken. Nothing else had been hers to take. And yet here was a strange little bundle, clutched so firmly that the baby whimpered when she tried to pry it free. Her breath clouded the air as she bent closer, whispering softly, "What have you got there, sweetheart?" She tugged gently, careful not to force the child's fingers open too quickly. The cloth felt old, stiff with age, smelling faintly of dust and something metallic beneath. The baby shifted and let out a small cry, the sound trembling in the storm, and she paused, unwilling to distress him further. His hand tightened, as if even in sleep and cold, he knew this thing must not be let go. She straightened slowly, scanning the street behind her, the dark windows of the houses, the snow-slick roofs hunched low under their burdens. For the first time since being cast out, she felt a chill that came not from the storm but from inside her chest. How had this object found its way into her child's grasp? Had he picked it up in the chaos of being rushed through the doorway? Had it fallen from a drawer, slipped from her husband's pocket? She remembered, then, the drawer in his desk, the one he had locked, the one she had never been allowed to open. She had seen him bend over it often, shoulders tense, as though guarding something too heavy for ordinary eyes. The cloth-covered thing seemed too deliberate, too carefully bundled, to be a stray trinket. She pulled the blanket more tightly around the baby, concealing the object once more, as if the very sight of it might draw unwanted attention from the silent houses around her. Her heart thudded in her chest, Faster now, a rhythm too quick to be soothed by the steady crunch of her boots in snow. She began to walk again, but her steps felt different, sharper, as though every sound carried meaning, as though the storm itself were listening. The baby gave a soft sigh and curled tighter into her chest, but the fist never loosened. She could feel the hardness of the object pressing faintly through the cloth into her ribs each time the child shifted. It was not heavy, but its presence seemed immense, filling the night with questions she dared not yet ask aloud. She lowered her eyes, whispered into the storm as if speaking only to herself. What did he leave us with, and why? The wind carried no answer. Only the baby's small hand, stubborn in its grip, told her that whatever this thing was, it mattered. More than warmth, more than shelter, more than the silence pressing in from every side. It mattered, and so she held her child closer, knowing that both of them were carrying more than they had ever expected to bear. The shape of it lingered in her mind as she walked, that little bundle clutched so tightly in her baby's hand. She tried to tell herself it was nothing, some scrap of cloth or harmless trinket that had slipped loose in confusion. But the longer she thought on it, the clearer the memory became. She had seen that cloth before. She could picture the frayed edge, the dull glint of metal beneath when the corner had lifted ever so slightly under lamplight. It had been months ago, maybe longer. She had been dusting the study, careful as always not to disturb his papers. Her husband's desk was a thing of order and control, ledgers stacked precisely, pens lined as if soldiers on parade, and that single drawer he kept locked. She remembered the sound of the key turning, the scrape of metal against wood, the way his shoulders always hunched when he bent over it. He never lingered with the other drawers, but that one, he opened it with a kind of reverence and suspicion both, guarding it as if it were more fragile than glass. She had only caught a glimpse once. He had been called suddenly to the door, and in his haste he had left the drawer ajar by the smallest margin. She hadn't meant to look, but curiosity is its own kind of gravity. She had leaned just far enough to see what lay within, that bundle of cloth, folded carefully around some weight, placed in the very center of the drawer as though the other items, loose envelopes, scraps of paper with numbers scribbled in his hand, were merely guards around it. The sight had fixed itself in her memory, though she had pushed it aside with the same force she used to ignore other suspicions. Now, trudging through the snow with the child pressed to her, the realization stung her sharper than the wind. If it was the same object, then her baby had not found it by accident. It must have slipped from his father's possession in the very moment of casting them out, a detail overlooked in anger, a secret surrender without intent. That thought chilled her deeper than the night air, because her husband was not the kind of man to overlook what mattered to him. If he valued enough to lock away, then losing it would not be something he forgave lightly. She quickened her steps, boots sinking deep in drifts that rose higher as the road bent away from the last of the lamps. Her mind replayed the evening she had passed the closed study door, hearing only the scratch of pen or the steady creak of his chair. Had he been writing in that hidden ledger? Had he been adding lines to whatever names and numbers filled its pages? The questions spun through her, each one heavier than the last. She bent her head over the baby, brushing snow from the tiny fist still locked around the bundle. The child stirred, whimpered, and settled again, refusing to release it even in sleep. She kissed the soft forehead, but her own thoughts were far from soothing. That drawer had always been a boundary in their house, one she was never meant to cross. And now, by some strange twist of fate, its contents had crossed to her. The wind howled down the empty street, filling her ears with sound like voices too far to understand. She clutched her child tighter, the memory of that locked drawer burning sharper than ever. Whatever secrets her husband had tried to bury inside it were now hers to carry, whether she wanted them or not. She tried again to loosen his tiny hand, her fingers gently prying at each curled digit, but the baby resisted with surprising strength. The fist clamped tighter, knuckles whitening, as though the object were an extension of his own fragile body. She whispered softly, coaxing, her breath rising in small clouds around them. "Let go! Sweetheart, it's all right. Mama just wants to keep you warm." Her words drifted into the storm, unanswered, while the baby's grip only grew firmer, his small chest rising in uneven rhythm beneath the blanket. She shifted beneath the falling snow, crouching to shield him from the wind, and tried again. She tugged at the cloth-wrapped bundle carefully, inch by inch, but the child whimpered, a low sound that trembled in his throat before blossoming into another cry. Startled, she pulled her hands back quickly, her own chest tightening at the sound. She rocked him gently, swaying despite the bitter cold, whispering apologies against his damp curls. The moment her hands released the object, he settled again, clutching it to his chest with a grip that looked almost deliberate, almost knowing. She rose slowly. Her knees stiffened the snow beneath her and felt an unease that had little to do with the storm. She had seen infants cling to fingers, to cloth, to the edge of a bottle, but this was different. This was tenacity, as though his tiny body understood something her mind had yet to grasp. She glanced behind her, the trail of footprints disappearing under fresh drifts. The night was too still, too watchful, and suddenly the bundle felt heavier than its size should allow. The baby shifted, pressing the object against himself as if guarding it, and she realized with a chill that he had not let go since she first noticed it. Not through her coaxing, not through his sleep, not even when his cries shook his body. His grip had only grown stronger, unrelenting. She wrapped the blanket tighter around him, letting the bundle remain in his hand, hidden now beneath the folds of wool. Perhaps it was safer this way. Perhaps the child's grip was the only protection it had left. Her husband's face rose in her memory. The cold eyes, the hard lines of his jaw when he locked that drawer. If he had kept this thing so guarded, then it was not meant for her, and certainly not meant for the child, now cradling it with stubborn fists. Yet here it was, carried out into the snow in the hands of the very person least capable of understanding its meaning, and yet perhaps most unwilling to surrender it. The irony twisted in her chest, bitter and strange. She pressed onward down the road, each step sinking into the silence, her arms trembling with fatigue. The storm thickened, but her thoughts were sharper than the wind, circling the same conclusion. She could not take it from him. Whatever that small bundle was, the baby had claimed it, and for reasons she could not name, she felt it must stay that way. So she kept walking, the child against her chest, his fingers locked around the secret he would not release. And in the darkness of the storm, it seemed to her that the night itself leaned closer, listening for what he carried. The lamps grew fewer with every step, their soft glow receding behind her like islands slipping beneath the tide. At first, the houses still huddled close, their roofs burdened with snow, their windows curtained against the storm. But then they thinned one by one, until gaps opened between them. Fields stretching pale and lifeless under the weight of winter. She knew the town's edge was near, though her legs already felt heavy, her breath shallow in her chest. The baby stirred against her, a soft sound muffled beneath the blanket, as if even he sensed a shift. The last lamp stood crooked at the corner of a sagging fence, its glass halo blurred with frost. She paused beneath it, the faint circle of light settling over her like a fragile blessing. The snow fell harder beyond that boundary, an unbroken curtain where the beam could not reach. She lingered there, her boots rooted in place, staring into the black expanse ahead. Darkness waited with open arms, wide and indifferent, swallowing the road that led beyond. Behind her, the town held its silence. No footsteps followed, no doors opened, no voices called her back. Only the faint whisper of curtains settling into place, the last proof that someone had been watching before deciding to turn away. It struck her with a hollow ache that even the thin comfort of light belonged to them, not her. Beyond this final lamp, she was untethered, stepping into a night where no one would bear witness. She adjusted her coat around the baby once more, tucking the edges tight. His tiny fist was still clenched, the hard bundle pressing faintly against her ribs. She dared not try again to take it. Not now. Perhaps, she thought, it was the one thing guiding them forward, some strange compass her child carried without knowing. The idea gave her the strength to lift her foot, to step beyond the lamp's glow and let the dark claim them both. The road narrowed here, lined on one side by the skeletal remains of fields, on the other by a row of barren trees that bent under the storm. Their branches creaked inside as the wind forced them to bow. The crunch of her boots was the only steady sound, each step swallowed too quickly by the snow. She felt as though she were walking deeper into silence itself, a silence thicker than that of the watching street, a silence that cared nothing for her survival. Her breath came harder, fog in the air and bursts. She pulled the child closer, pressing her cheek against the soft crown of his head. For a fleeting moment she closed her eyes and pretended the dark was not waiting, that she might yet find another lamp, another house, another door that opened. But when she opened them again, there was only the storm and the empty stretch of road disappearing ahead. The outskirts had always seemed ordinary in daylight, a line where the town ended and countryside began. Tonight it felt like a border between two worlds, the one she had been cast out of and one she did not yet understand. The light faded behind her, swallowed in the storm, and she kept moving forward, step by step, into the vast and waiting dark. The dark pressed heavier the farther she walked, her boots dragging through drifts that threatened to swallow her steps altogether. The baby stirred faintly, a soft sound like a plea, and she whispered him though the wind tore her words to pieces. Her arms trembled from holding him so long against her chest, but she dared not loosen her grip. Her eyes scanned the horizon for anything that might resemble shelter, something more than fields and trees bending low with the storm. It was then she saw it. A shadowed outline just beyond the road's bend, slumped against the whiteness like a weary sentinel. As she drew closer, the shape took form. A barn, its roof sagging beneath years of neglect and winter's weight. Its timbers leaned unevenly, boards gapped where the wind slipped through, but it stood all the same, a remnant from another time. She remembered it faintly from stories, how the old mill had closed, how the barns were left to rot, one by one. Children used to dare each other to step inside before the floor gave way or the roof fell in. Now it looked less like a ruin and more like the only chance she had. She approached slowly, every instinct wary of collapse. The door hung crooked on its hinges, one side dragging in the snow, leaving a jagged gap wide enough to squeeze through. She pressed her shoulder against it and slipped inside, pulling the weight of the storm shut behind her as best she could. The silence that followed was different than the silence outside, denser, muffled, carrying the scent of dust and damp wood. Inside, shadows stretched across the emptiness. Broken tools lay scattered in corners, rusted metal half buried beneath straw that had long since turned to brittle husks. The roof groaned now and then, snow shifting on its spine, but the beams held. She exhaled slowly, her breath cloudy in the cold air, and sank to her knees against the wall. For the first time since being cast out, she let her body rest, the weight of her child heavy but steady in her arms. The baby whimpered again, fingers still clenched around a hidden bundle, and she pulled the blanket tighter around him. She brushed a kiss against his forehead, murmuring quiet assurances. The barn offered no warmth, but it spared them the lash of the wind and the relentless fall of snow. It was enough, at least for the moment. She leaned her head back against the wall, listening to the creaks and sighs of the structure, her body shivering, but her mind unwilling to let go of vigilance. She thought of the life that once pulsed here, cattle lowing, hay piled high, the steady rhythm of work and labor. Now only ghosts remain, dust in the rafters and echoes in the floorboards. And into that emptiness she had stepped, carrying her child and the secret bundled in his hand. She felt as though the barn itself might bear witness, its broken frame watching quietly, holding them in its hollow chest. Outside, the storm howled and clawed at the walls, but within, she held her baby close, whispering promises she could not yet see a way to keep. The barn shuddered once more, but it did not fall, and for tonight, that was enough. She had shelter. She had her child. She had a secret she did not yet understand. And so, in the hollow of an old barn abandoned by the world, she breathed, and for a moment, she allowed herself to believe they would make it through until morning. The barn breathed with the sounds of age, groans in its beams, sighs through its loose boards, the faint rustle of snow pressing against its walls. She sat in the corner where the wind reached least, her child nestled close, both of them cocooned in the layered weight of her coat and blanket. The baby had at last grown still, his small chest rising and falling with the steadiness of sleep, but his tiny fist remained locked around the bundle, as though it belonged to him alone. For a long minute she simply held him, exhausted, letting her body sink against the wall. But the thought gnawed at her until she could no longer resist. She had to see. Her eyes searched the barn until they caught on a rusted lantern perched on an old crate. She reached for it, fingers stiff with cold, and shook it lightly. To her surprise, it still held oil. She struck the flint once, twice, until a weak flame caught, sputtering before blooming into a trembling light. Shadows jumped across the rafters, revealing more emptiness and shelter, but the glow was enough. She drew the lantern closer, its warmth faint but present, and turned her attention to the child's hand. Carefully, she began to work. She stroked the baby's fingers, whispering his name in the softest voice she could manage, coaxing his grip to ease just enough. At last, with patience and trembling hands, she loosened the tiny fist, inch by inch, until the bundle slipped free. The baby whimpered, half stirring, then settled again against her chest. She kissed the curls on his damp head, then lowered her gaze to what she now held. The cloth was coarse, worn thin at the edges, fraying where time had worried at its threads. She recognized it at once, the same faded fabric she had glimpsed in that locked drawer months ago. She unfolded it slowly, careful not to tear it, her breath catching with each layer she revealed. The lantern light flickered against the object inside until finally it lay bare in her palm. It was a ledger, small, leather-bound, its cover scuffed with years of handling. She brushed her fingers over it, and the texture of the leather seemed both foreign and achingly familiar. Her husband's handwriting, unmistakable, was etched in black ink across the first page she dared open. Lines of numbers, names, columns arranged with meticulous order filled the paper. Not household accounts, not anything she recognized as belonging to the simple life they were meant to share. The names leapt at her first, men she knew, men she passed in the street, officials whose voices carried authority in town meetings. Each one tied to figures, to symbols, to notes and margins she could not fully decipher. Some pages bore dates, others bore codes, long strings of numbers with circles drawn around them as though marking significance. She turned page after page, her hand trembling, her breath quickening in the cold air. The ledger was not just a record. It was a map of something hidden, something he had guarded with a secrecy she now understood. She felt the weight of it press harder than the child in her arms. Her husband had cast her out with nothing, but in his fury he had let slip the one thing he had never meant to lose. And now, by chance or fate, it rested with her. She closed the book gently, wrapping the cloth back around it with care. Her baby stirred again, as though searching for it, and she slid it back into the fold of his blanket, where he could cling to it once more. She kissed his forehead and whispered a promise she had not intended to make. "I'll keep it safe." The lantern flame wavered, shadows deepening, but her eyes stayed fixed on the bundle. She knew, with a certainty that tightened her chest, that the night had shifted. What she carried now was more than survival. It was truth, and truth had its own storm waiting to be faced. The weight of it sat heavy in her lap, far greater than its size should allow. At first glance it might have seemed harmless, a pocket-sized book bound in weathered leather, its corners softened by years of use. But when she opened it, the truth spread before her in lines of ink that seemed to pulse with meaning. Each page was alive with names written in her husband's firm hand, columns filled with numbers that marched in relentless order, and symbols scrawled in margins she could not decipher. It was no toy, no idle notebook. It was a ledger, a hidden record meant for no eyes but his, and now it lay open under the faint light of a barn lantern. Her fingers lingered on the first page. She saw names she recognized immediately, neighbors whose children had played with hers in warmer months, men whose hats she had nodded to in the town square. She turned another page, and the pattern grew darker. There were officials listed here, the sheriff, the mayor, even the pastor whose sermons filled Sunday mornings with words of judgment and salvation. Each name was tied to figures, to dates, to codes that wound like threads binding them together. The numbers carried weight, too large to be casual, too precise to be error. She felt her stomach twist as she traced the ink, her breath catching with each discovery. It wasn't only the presence of names, but the notes beside them. Phrases in shorthand, circles around certain dates, marks that suggested debts or payments. Perhaps worse. She thought of her husband's late nights in the study, his curt replies when she asked why he stayed up so long with his papers. She had accepted his silence then, telling herself it was work she could never understand. Now she saw it differently. The silence had been secrecy, and the drawer had held far more than private accounts. She closed her eyes for a moment, the barn creaking above her, the storm battering against its sides. She pressed her lips to her baby's head, as though the contact could steady her. But the knowledge would not retreat. It wrapped itself around her as tightly as the cold had on the street. She realized that she held more than evidence of numbers and names. She held the web of men who had built the walls of the very town that now ignored her. Her mind ran with questions she had no way to answer. Was it money being moved in secret? Favors traded in shadows? Or something far worse? Something tied to the disappearances she had heard whispered about but never dared to repeat? She thought of the sheriff's knock on their door weeks ago, his brief conversation with her husband carried out in low tones while she was asked to fetch tea. She had thought it nothing then, but now the memory throbbed like a bruise. The baby shifted against her, small fists curling tighter around the cloth in which she had rewrapped the book. He would not let it go, as if some unspoken instinct urged him to cling to what he could not yet understand. She covered his hand with her own, shielding both him and the ledger from the draft that crept through the barn's broken boards. She knew this much. It could not fall back into her husband's possession, nor into the hands of the men whose names filled its pages. She closed the ledger again, her thumb brushing the worn spine. Its weight was more than leather and paper. It was the sum of secrets powerful men had meant to keep buried. And now those secrets belonged to her, a woman cast into the snow with nothing but a child in her arms. She lifted her head, staring into the flicker of the lantern flame. Her husband's voice still echoed in her memory, cold and final. But she realized that night had given her more than exile. It had given her the one thing he had never meant her to find. The lantern light trembled across the page, making the words shift and ripple as though they were alive. Yet she could not mistake them. The handwriting was his. Every loop of a letter, every sharp stroke of a number, belonged to a man whose voice had cast her into the night. She had watched his hand move across countless lists over the years. Grocery notes, messages to neighbors, even the small reminders he left for her on the kitchen table. That same hand had written these pages, though the weight of these words was nothing like those harmless scraps. Here, his letters were tighter, more deliberate, as though he knew even then they were not meant for her eyes. She traced one line slowly with her fingertip, her skin brushing against the indentation of the ink pressed hard into the paper. He had written with force, as though to ensure no one could doubt what was recorded. The names sat in neat rows, some underlined, some followed by amounts that made her chest tighten. There were code beside them, too, strings of numbers and symbols she could not decipher, but the certainty of his authorship left her shaken. It was not rumor or suspicion she carried now. It was proof, written in the very hand that had once written love at the bottom of his letters. Her memory flickered back unbidden to the nights she had passed the study door and heard the steady scratch of pen against paper. How many times had she assumed he was doing accounts, or correspondence, or any of the ordinary tasks that filled a man's hours? How many times had she pushed away the urge to ask, to step inside, to demand he share what kept him so late at his desk? She had let trust blind her, or perhaps fear. He had always been quick to anger when she lingered too long near his papers, his voice tightening as he asked her to leave. Now she understood why. She turned another page, her hands trembling slightly, and again the proof stared back at her. The same handwriting, the same steady rhythm of lines and figures, page after page. This was not the work of a man dabbling. It was a work of someone deeply woven into whatever network these pages described. And the more she saw, the colder she felt. Not from a draft creeping through the barn, but from the realization that the man who had thrown her into the snow was tied to something vast, something hidden. The baby stirred in her arms, his little hand brushing against the wrapped ledger, as though reminding her not to look too long, not to lose herself in the ink. She kissed his head absently, eyes still on the page. The thought struck her with painful clarity. The same man who had once cradled his child now placed himself in league with names written here, men who would never cradle, never protect, only take. The intimacy of his handwriting made the betrayal sharper, as though the ink itself had turned against her. She closed the book for a moment, pressing it to her chest, her eyes burning though no tears fell. To carry his words now felt like both curse and weapon. His hand had condemned her, but his hand had also, unknowingly, given her the means to expose him. The irony cut deep. She tightened her hold on the baby, whispering into the curls damp against his forehead. "Your father wrote this, and now it's ours to bear." The lantern flickered. The barn creaked and the snow battered against the walls, but her gaze stayed fixed on the ledger. Every stroke of his pen was unmistakable. Every line was him, and though he had turned her into nothing with his words, here in her arms lay proof that he had built his power on secrets he could no longer keep. The longer she stared at the open pages, the harder her breath caught in her throat. At first the names had been a blur, just rows of ink scrawled with precision, but slowly they resolved into something far more haunting. She began to recognize them. Familiar names, belonging not to distant strangers, but to men whose paths crossed hers almost daily. There was a grocer, whose wife had once sent soup when she was ill. There was the banker, whose smile never reached his eyes, but who nodded politely whenever they met in town. And then, written with the same careful hand, were names that reached higher, officials, councilmen. The pastor whose voice rang out in judgment every Sunday morning. She turned the page again, and her breath stopped altogether when her eyes fell on the sheriff's name. The letters were stark, deliberate, impossible to mistake. A number sat beside it, followed by symbols and marks she could not decipher. But the name alone was enough. The man charged with enforcing order, the one whose badge gleamed whenever he walked down Main Street, whose word carried away the law itself. His name was inked into her husband's secret record like any other. She felt her stomach twist as she recalled the sheriff's visits. He had come to their door more than once, each time exchanging hushed words with her husband while she was sent to fetch tea or step into another room. She had thought nothing of it at the time, convincing herself that it was official business too complex or tedious for her to understand. But now, with his name staring back at her from the ledger, she saw those visits differently. They were not the calls of law and duty. They were meetings between men bound by something hidden. Her eyes drifted to other entries. Each name was paired with numbers, amounts too large to be casual. Some entries bore circles around dates. Others carried short notes in the margins, initials perhaps, or cryptic marks that seemed to signal a system she could not yet decipher. But one truth pressed through with clarity. These men were linked together, and her husband had been at the center of it, writing it all down in this book that was never meant to be found. She thought of the pastor, his sermons filled with fire and warning, urging the congregation to live in honesty and obedience. His name appeared twice, each time beside sums that dwarfed anything an ordinary preacher could explain. She thought of the banker, his polished shoes clattering against the steps of the town hall, his voice firm when speaking of thrift and responsibility. His name was underlined, followed by a figure that seemed impossibly large. And the sheriff, his name repeated again and again, as though he were more deeply tangled than any of the rest. Her skin prickled as she realized what the ledger implied. This was not the quiet bookkeeping of one man. This was evidence of a web, a network of power and exchange hidden beneath the ordinary rhythm of town. Men who appeared righteous, men who appeared dutiful, men who smiled in the daylight, all tied together in ink that bound them more tightly than any oath spoken aloud. She closed the book suddenly, clutching to her chest, her breath ragged in the cold air of the barn. The baby stirred in her arms, his small fist still pressed against the cloth. She kissed the soft crown of his head, whispering without knowing she spoke, "Names that shouldn't be here, names that will not let me rest." The lantern flickered, shadows shifting across the wooden walls, and she realized the danger was no longer only her husband's anger. If these men ever discovered she held the ledger, there would be nowhere left in town, or beyond. It would be safe to go. The baby's cries had thinned to little sighs, fragile threads of sound that dwindled until they were no more than soft breaths against her chest. His body, warm and pliant, grew heavier in her arms as sleep overtook him. The small hand still curled protectively around the cloth bundle even in dreams. She rocked him instinctively, though there was no need now. The rhythm more for herself than for him. The silence that followed felt almost too wide, too sudden after the storm of his wails. It left her with nothing to shield her thoughts, and they came quickly, pressing in from all sides. She leaned back against the barn wall, the wood cold even through her coat, and let her eyes settle on the lantern's dim flame. The light carved a small circle around them, leaving the rest of the barn in shadow, as though the world beyond its glow had ceased to exist. Her thoughts circled back to the ledger, resting now against the baby's chest, hidden in folds of blanket. She could still see the names in her mind, the careful script of her husband, the figures that whispered transactions too large, too dangerous for ordinary men. She closed her eyes, and in the darkness behind her lids the faces of those men rose up one by one. The sheriff, with his heavy boots and careful eyes, had passed her on the street just days ago, tipping his hat in a gesture that now felt poisoned. The pastor's voice echoed too, the sharpness of his sermons ringing hollow when placed beside his name scrawled in her husband's hand. Even the grocer, whose wife had once shared flour with her in leaner days, was there among the columns. It was as if the entire town had been split open by those pages, revealing a rot beneath what had always seemed solid. The baby shifted slightly, a soft exhale escaping his lips, and she bent her head to kiss the damp curls on his forehead. For a moment she let herself sink into the rhythm of his breathing, steady and untroubled. He knew nothing of ledgers, of codes, of secrets that tied powerful men together in chains of ink. All he knew was warmth, the steady thrum of her heartbeat, the closeness of arms that would not let him fall. She envied him that innocence, wished she could curl herself inside it too, let the world slip away until morning brought something softer. But morning would not soften anything. It would only sharpen the danger. She thought again of her husband, of his face hard as stone when he had spoken those words that cast her out. He had believed himself rid of her, of the burden she and the baby represented. But he had not known what the child carried with him into the night. The irony burned in her chest. He had locked the ledger away, guarded it more fiercely than he had guarded his marriage, and yet it was his own son's small hand that had carried it out into the snow. The baby sighed again, deep in sleep, and she smoothed the blanket over him. In that fragile peace she let herself breathe more evenly, though her mind refused to rest. She knew the ledger was more than paper. It was danger, a weapon perhaps, or a key to something she did not yet understand. And as the storm pressed against the barn walls, she realized she could not remain still forever. The child's sleep gave her time to think, but thought alone would not save them. When he woke again, when his cries returned, she would have to decide where to go and who, if anyone, could be trusted with the truth she now carried in her arms. The sound came first, a low moan pressed through cracks in the barn walls, then the steady hiss of snow thickening into a roar. She had known storms before, but this one carried a weight that made the timbers shiver above her head. Each gust slammed against the sagging boards like a fist, rattling nails that had long since given up their grip. She drew the baby closer, tucking his head beneath her chin, and pulled the blanket tighter around them both. The lantern flame flickered wildly, shadows leaping high into the rafters, until at last it steadied into a wavering glow. Beyond its reach, the storm clawed against every weakness in the barn, determined to remind her that there would be no leaving tonight. Snow sifted in through gaps where boards had warped, piling along the floor in soft drifts. It pressed harder against the walls, a white tide rising outside, sealing her in as though the storm itself had claimed the building. She rose briefly to test the door, pressing against its crooked frame, but it refused to budge more than an inch. The weight of snow outside pinned it closed, a wall of ice she could not break. She let fall shut again, the latch rattling weakly, and knew then that morning was her only chance. Until then, she was trapped with the child, the ledger, and the restless silence of her thoughts. She sank back against the wall, her body aching from the strain of carrying him so far. The baby slept still, heavy with exhaustion, his breath warm against her collarbone. She studied his face in the lantern's dim light, the small features softened in dreams, unaware of the storm raging beyond the walls. The innocence steadied her, though it also cut deep, for she knew she could not let that innocence meet the truth too soon. For now, she could only keep him safe, even if it meant waiting out the storm in a place that creaked with each gust, threatening to collapse. Her thoughts circled back, as they always did, to the ledger. She reached beneath the blanket and felt the faint outline of it against her child's small hand. The leather was cool, the corners sharp even through the cloth. She imagined her husband's fury when he discovered it missing, the way his jaw would set, the way he would stop at nothing to retrieve it. If the sheriff's name was inside, then the law itself would move against her. And yet here she was, cornered by snow and silence, with no ally but the frail warmth of her own body and the trust of the baby too young to understand. The storm howled louder, rattling the roof. Snow slipped from the rafters above, falling in dull thuds onto the straw below. She pulled the lantern closer, listening, half afraid the weight of it all might bring the barn down. But the beams, though weary, held. They groaned and bent, but they did not break. She took comfort in that, telling herself that perhaps she could do the same, bend beneath the storm without giving way. Hours stretched thin, marked only by the shift of shadows and the pounding rhythm of the wind. She could not leave, not tonight. Morning might bring clearer skies, or it might bring danger waiting on the road. For now, there was only the storm, the child in her arms, and the knowledge of the snow outside pressed higher with every breath she took, sealing her into this place where secrets and survival tangled together in the dark. At first she thought it was the storm itself, the restless shifting of snow against the barn walls, the creak of ice breaking beneath its own weight. She sat perfectly still, the baby pressed against her chest, listening past the roar of wind. Then it came again, distinct this time, not the sigh of snow, but the measured rhythm of boots pressing down into the frozen earth. Crunch, pause, crunch. The sound circled the barn slowly, deliberate, as though whoever was wanted her to hear, but not to see. Her breath caught in her throat. She shifted the baby slightly, tucking his face deeper into folds of her coat, and pressed her back against the wall until the rough wood dug into her spine. The lantern sputtered nearby, its faint glow of betrayal. She reached out with one shaking hand and cupped the flame, lowering the wick until the light shrank into a dim flicker. The barn sank into deeper shadow, the corners thickening with darkness. Still, the boots moved. They traced the perimeter with patience, circling like a predator, measuring the strength of its cage. The snow outside muffled much of the sound, but each step carried clearly enough for her to imagine the figure. Shoulders hunched against the storm, breath rising in white plumes, eyes sweeping over every crack in the boards. She thought of the names in the ledger, the sheriff's among them, and her stomach turned cold. If her husband had already realized what had slipped from his drawer, if he had understood what the baby carried out into the snow, then it would not be long before he sent someone to fetch it back. And who better than the sheriff himself, a man who owed his silence to the same book, now resting against her child. The baby stirred, letting out a soft whimper, and she tightened her hold quickly, rocking just enough to soothe him. "Sure," she whispered, though her own voice trembled. The sound of his small cry seemed impossibly loud in the hush between footsteps. Outside, the boots stopped. Silence pressed in, thicker than before, broken only by the wind rattling the roof. She held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she feared it might echo through the boards. Then the steps resumed, slower now, as though whoever lingered outside had paused to listen too. They scraped along the far wall, the sound of weight brushing snow aside. She pictured a hand dragging along the barn's outer boards, fingers tracing for gaps, ears bent close to listen. She clutched the baby tighter, one palm pressed over the blanket where the ledger lay hidden. Her entire body curled as though she could make herself vanish into the straw. The circle continued, one side to the next, until at last the boots came to rest near the door. The latch rattled faintly, just once, testing, before the storm's howl swallowed it. She waited, every muscle rigid, expecting the door to be forced open. But it did not come. Instead, the boots moved again, fading into the storm, their rhythm swallowed slowly by wind and snow. She did not move. Minutes passed, then longer still, her body aching from tension, her breath shallow as though even the air might betray her. Only when the storm reclaimed the night, completely, did she allow herself to breathe again. Whoever had circled the barn knew someone was inside. The question that gnawed at her as the baby slept again was not whether they would return, but when the knock came just as she began to believe the storm itself might bury the memory of those footsteps. It was not a timid sound, not the uncertain tapping of someone offering aid. It was sharp, deliberate, and steady, echoing through the hollow barn like the strike of a gavel. Each rap carried weight, a message wrapped in its rhythm. Whoever stood outside knew she was there, and they were not asking permission to come in. Her heart lurched. The baby stirred at the sound, a faint cry pushing through his lips, and she hushed him quickly, rocking in small circles while her eyes fixed on the crooked door. The lantern flame trembled as if it, too, felt the intrusion. Then came the voice, low but unmistakable, carrying through the wind with the authority of someone who had long grown used to being obeyed. "It's cold out here. Best open up." The sheriff. She knew his drawl instantly, the way words dragged slightly, the quiet menace beneath even the simplest phrase. She had heard that voice on the street many times, booming with false cheer, calling out greetings to neighbors, issuing orders to his deputies. But here, in the dark and abandoned barn, his tone carried no warmth. It was not an offer of rescue. It was a warning. She pressed herself against the wall, willing the baby to stillness, her own breath shallow as though sound alone might give them away. The ledger, hidden within the folds of the blanket, pressed hard against her ribs. She thought of his name inked clearly in her husband's hand, of the numbers beside it, of the symbols she could not decipher but knew meant something binding. She imagined him discovering that she had seen it, that she knew, and her stomach twisted until she thought she might be sick. The sheriff knocked again, slower this time, each strike dragging across her nerves. "I know you're in there," he said, voice raised only slightly to carry through the storm. "A woman and a babe don't last long in weather like this. Better open before the roof falls in." The words held the shape of concern, but none of the weight. They were spoken like lines rehearsed, a script meant to draw her into answering. He did not want to help. He wanted what she carried. She did not move. The baby shifted, gave a small whimper, and she pressed a kiss to his head, rocking gently until he quieted again. The sheriff waited a moment longer, silence stretching thin, and then his voice came softer, closer to the door. "You've got something don't belong to you. Best not let it slip too far from its place." The words dropped heavy, and she felt her blood run cold. He knew. Somehow he knew the ledger had passed into her hands, that the secret her husband had guarded so fiercely now rested in the arms of a child. The door rattled once, tested but not forced. Then the sound of boots shifted, crunching slowly in the snow, fading into the storm. But she knew he had not gone far. Men like him did not retreat. They circled. They waited. They let fear settle until it did half their work for them. She pressed her back harder against the wall, the baby warm against her chest, the ledger a weight she could no longer imagine setting down. The knock still echoed in her ears, a warning that her refuge was no refuge at all, and that by morning, the store would not be her only enemy. Her hands trembled as she held the ledger, its weight pressing down heavier than the wood and snow that groaned above her. She had unwrapped it once more after the sheriff's knock faded into the storm, half in fear, half in compulsion, needing to reassure herself it was still there, that it had not somehow vanished into the dark. The leather was cold under her fingers, the pages swollen slightly from age, but the names and numbers were as sharp as ever in her memory. She wanted to find a place to hide in the barn, some crevice where prying eyes would not think to look, yet every option seemed too fragile, too obvious. The rafters, the straw, even the hollow behind the boards. Any of them could be searched in seconds. She turned her gaze to the child in her arms, his breathing slow, the faintest hum of contentment in his sleep. His hand, still small and soft, was curled as it had been since the beginning, tight around the cloth in which the ledger had first been bundled. She had tried to pry it away before, and he had resisted with a strength that startled her. Now in the half-light, she understood something that unsettled her deeply. His grip was more certain than hers. Where she hesitated, fearing every sound and shadow, he clutched with an innocence that did not waver, as though the act itself were written into him. She brushed her lips against his forehead, then slipped the ledger back into its cloth wrapping. Carefully, she guided his hand around it once more, pressing his fingers until they curled and closed. The baby shifted, whimpered briefly, then settled again with the bundle held fast to his chest. She exhaled a shuddering breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her decision final. He would keep it, not because he understood, but because no one would think to search the hands of an infant. The sheriff could tear apart every plank of this barn. Her husband could upend every hiding place she might devise, but neither of them would imagine that the child himself was the keeper. The trust felt heavy, almost unbearable. She was placing not just her life, but is in the path of danger, yet she could see no other way. The barn offered no lock, no true protection. The storm itself was both shield and trap, keeping the sheriff at bay for now, but leaving her cornered until morning. The only certainty she had was the stubborn strength of her son's small hand. She tightened the blanket around him, making sure the bundle was concealed from view. Her fingers lingered there, unwilling to pull away, as though she could pass some silent instruction into his sleep. Hold on, don't let go, no matter what comes. The lantern's flame flickered, throwing shadows across the rafters, and for a moment she imagined the barn itself bearing witness to this fragile arrangement, its old beams and weatherboards leaning closer as if to guard the secret with her. Outside, the wind howled, pressing harder against the sagging roof. Snow battered the walls, sealing her further into her corner, but she no longer looked to the storm with the same fear. The greater danger lay with men whose names filled the ledger, men who would not rest until it was back in their grasp. She kissed her child's forehead once more, her lips lingering on his warm skin, and whispered, "Keep it safe." It was a plea, a command, and a prayer all in one. When she finally leaned back against the wall, her body aching with exhaustion, her eyes did not leave the small bundle hidden in the folds of the blanket. She knew she had no power to guard it alone, but in the hands of her child, hands that would not release it even in sleep. It was safer than anywhere she could ever place it. The barn had grown colder as the night stretched on, the lantern's flames shrinking low, barely enough to push back the shadows. She had begun to believe the sheriff had left altogether, that his boots had carried him back through the storm to warmer quarters where men like him planned how to keep their secrets. But then came the sound again, measured steps pressing into the snow outside, a hand brushing the door in deliberate strokes before a voice slipped through the cracks. "Ma'am," the sheriff called. His tone softened, though it rang false to her ears. "It's a cruel night to be out here with a babe. I can get you safely out of town. See you on your way where no storm will trouble you." His words lingered, riding the howl of wind, promising warmth and rescue. Then, after a pause, he added the weight beneath them, "All I need is the book." Her breath caught, though she did not move from her place in the corner. She had known this was coming, but hearing it spoken aloud froze the marrow in her bones. She pressed the baby closer, feeling his small warmth, his hand curled stubbornly around the wrapped ledger. The sheriff's voice carried the confidence of a man who expected agreement, who believed his offer would sound like deliverance to a woman pushed past her breaking point. She stayed silent, the storm filling the gap where her reply should have been. The sheriff knocked lightly, not the sharp command before, but a gentle rhythm, almost courteous. "You've no use for it," he continued. "It's just ink and paper to you. But to men who know its meaning, it's a matter best kept quiet. Hand it over, and I'll see you're not troubled again. You and the boy can go free." The words settled heavily in the barn, and she could almost imagine them as truth. Safety, escape, a road that would take her far from the cold and the weight of the secret. Yet she thought of the names written in her husband's hand, the numbers circled, the sheriff's own letters among them. She thought of the neighbors who had turned their curtains against her, of the pastor's sermons, of the banker's polished smile, each one tied together by the book the sheriff now sought to claim. If she gave it over, it would vanish back into silence, and all she had endured tonight would mean nothing. The baby stirred, shifting slightly, his fist tightening around the cloth as though in answer. She kissed the crown of his head, her lips brushing his damp hair, and let the sheriff's offer hang unanswered. She did not trust the softness of his tone, nor the promise of safe passage. Safety for men like him came only at the cost of obedience, and obedience would strip her of the only weapon she possessed. The sheriff knocked once more, firmer this time, impatience creeping into the sound. "Think on it," he said at last. "Storm won't break till morning. By then, you want to be gone. When you're ready, you know what to do." His boots shifted in the snow, steps retreating but not far, lingering just beyond. She remained where she was, heart pounding, the baby quiet once more against her. The offer had been made, but it was not salvation. It was a chain dressed as mercy. She held her child closer, her hand brushing the hidden ledger, and told herself she would not trade truth for comfort. Not now, not ever. The storm might cage her until dawn, but at least within its walls the book was still hers to keep. The sheriff's words clung to the barn long after his boots had faded into the snow. His voice seemed to linger in the rafters, a whisper threaded to the draft that slipped between warped boards. She sat unmoving, her back pressed to the wall, the baby warm and heavy in her arms. He had offered her escape, a road out of the storm, but the price had been too steep. She lowered her eyes when he spoke, not in submission but in silence, and her silence was her answer. She would not hand it over. The baby stirred against her chest, small fingers tightening around the cloth where the ledger lay hidden. That gesture, more than her own strength, steadied her. The child held the book as though it belonged to him alone, as though even in sleep he understood that some burdens could not be surrendered. She rocked him gently, the rhythm keeping her own fear from breaking loose. She could almost hear her husband's voice again, cold and final, as he cast her out, and the sheriff's words had carried the same echo. But this time she had not begged, had not pleaded. She had met power with silence, and silence was its own kind of defiance. The wind battered harder at the roof, driving snow against the barn like fists, but she barely heard it. Her thoughts moved in circles, chasing the shape of what her refusal meant. The sheriff would not forget. He would not forgive. He would wait until morning, or send others, men whose names were written in the ledger alongside his. They would not rest until the book was back in their hands. By keeping it, she had marked herself, though no mark showed on her skin. She knew it as surely as she knew the storm would not last forever. When dawn came, she would have more to fear than the cold. Still, she could not force her hands to loosen. Every instinct in her told her to protect what had fallen into her keeping, even if she did not fully understand its meaning. She bent her head low, pressing her cheek against her baby's curls, and let her silence be her vow. If her husband had thought her weak, if the sheriff believed she could be persuaded, they would learn otherwise. She had been given no voice in her own home, no voice in her banishment. But here, in the hollow of an abandoned barn, she discovered a voice that did not need sound. Refusal lived in the way of her arms, in the steady set of her jaw, in the way she would not answer when called. The lantern sputtered, casting long shadows across the floor. She watched them move, restless shapes shifting with each gust, and felt the hours stretch like taut wire. The storm would not allow her to leave tonight. She was bound to wait it out, to meet whatever came with dawn. Yet her choice had already been made. She would not surrender the ledger. She would not trade it for mercy spoken in a voice that had no truth behind it. The baby breathed evenly, lost in the safety of dreams, and she envied that peace. She kissed his forehead and whispered words only he could hear, words too soft for the storm to steal. "We will not bow." It was not anger that filled her, nor bravado, but something steadier, something that burned quiet and low. Her refusal was not loud, not dramatic, but it was immovable. She would hold her child closer. She would keep the book hidden in his hands. And she would let silence speak for her until the moment came to act. The knock had not come again, but she knew he was still there. His presence clung to the night like smoke, unseen yet impossible to escape. She had lulled herself into believing he had left, that perhaps the storm had driven him back to shelter, but when the door shuttered softly, she understood he had only been waiting. The latch rattled faintly, then steadied, and a shadow passed across the narrow crack, where the lantern's glow slipped out. She held her breath, clutching the baby tight, praying the bundle would not stir. Then it happened. A hand slid briefly inside, fingers brushing the air just within. In that single motion, they grazed a lantern set too close to the door. It toppled with metallic clatter, its glass striking the floorboards and rolling before the flame guttered. For a breath, the barn was lit brighter than before, a flare of sudden heat. Then everything was swallowed in darkness. The silence that followed was more crushing than the storm's roar, a silence that made her skin crawl. Her eyes strained against the black, desperate for even the faintest outline. But there was nothing. Only the sound of her own breathing, uneven and loud, and the faint shift of the baby against her chest. The absence of light felt like a trap sprung. She pressed herself back into the corner, the rough boards digging into her spine, and willed her body to stillness. Somewhere on the other side of the door the sheriff lingered, his shadow pressing against the barn, though she could not see it. The baby whimpered, a tiny sound that might have been lost to storm, but, in the dark, seemed to echo like thunder. She rocked him quickly, her lips brushing his forehead, whispering shushing sounds that quivered with fear. If the sheriff had been uncertain before, if he had been circling and listening, now he knew for certain. The light had betrayed them both, and in the dark, she was nothing but a heartbeat and a breath away from discovery. The barn groaned under the storm, wind battering at the roof, snow piling against its walls, but the noise no longer comforted her. It felt instead like a chorus to the sheriff's patience, the storm buying him time to wait her out. She thought of striking the lantern again, of fumbling in the dark for flint, but the risk was too great. A spark might show her face, might reveal the bundle tucked into the baby's blanket, and that was something she could not allow. Better the dark, even if it left her blind. Her mind churned with fragments, the names inked in her husband's hand, the numbers beside them, the sheriff's own entries standing bold among the rest. She imagined him crouched just outside the door, lips curled in the faintest smile, certain that the cold and the dark would do his work for him. She felt anger rise with her fear, a quiet burn in her chest. Not enough to erase her terror, but enough to remind her why she must not break. The baby's fist shifted against her ribs, still clinging to the bundle, and she laid her hand gently over his. In that touch, she steadied herself. If she could not see, then neither could he. Darkness hid them both, and sometimes survival lived in the art of waiting. So she sat in silence, her breath shallow, her body still, the barn cloaked in blackness, and told herself that dawn would come. If she could endure until then, the storm might yet be her ally. Until that moment, she would let the dark swallow her, trusting to guard her more faithfully than any sheriff's hand ever could. The dark held her in its grip long after the lantern fell silent. She sat frozen, her ears straining for the sound of boots outside, her heartbeat heavy enough to drown out the storm's roar. Each breath felt stolen, each second borrowed. The sheriff was waiting. She could feel it in the marrow of her bones. If she stayed, dawn would bring him inside, and there would be no corner left to hide in. Her hand brushed along the rough boards at her back, fingertips finding the seams where the wood had warped and separated with age. She pressed lightly at first, then harder, until one of the planks shifted under her palm. The barn had been left a ruin since the mill closed, its bones weak and weathered. She pushed again, feeling the cold bite through the gap as snow sifted in. A path lay behind those boards, not safe, not certain, but free of the sheriff's shadow. The baby stirred as she moved, his small fist tightening around the bundle hidden in his blanket. She kissed the top of his head and whispered against his curls, though her voice was barely a breath. "Hold on." He whimpered but did not wake. She shifted her weight carefully, her body aching from the hours pressed against the cold floor, and began to work the board loose. Each creak felt deafening, yet the storm outside swallowed the sound, a curtain of wind and snow masking her efforts. At last the plank gave way enough for her to slip her shoulder through. The night beyond was a wall of white, flakes driving sideways, the ground already buried. She pulled the board wider, her strength fueled by desperation, until there was just enough space to pass through. She tightened the blanket around the child, tucking the ledger more firmly against his chest, then squeezed into the gap, though it scraped her back, tearing at her coat. But then the storm claimed her, snow slapping her face and stinging her eyes. The cold was a shock, fierce and immediate, but she did not stop. Behind her, the barn sagged in the dark, its crooked frame now a trap she would not return to. Ahead lay only the storm, no path, no light, just an endless field of white. She staggered forward, her boots sinking deep, each step an effort that pulled her muscles raw. The wind clawed at her, dragging her hair loose, biting through every layer she wore. Still she moved, clutching her child close, her body bent against the gale. The snow swallowed all sound but its own. The sheriff's voice no longer carried. His boots could not be heard. It was as though she had stepped into another world, one where only she and her baby existed. Fragile figures pressing through a night that sought to bury them. Her arms ached, her chest burned, but she whispered in with every step, words of comfort she barely believed herself. We're going just a little farther. Behind her, she imagined the sheriff discovering the broken board, his hand pressing against the jagged edge where she had forced her way out. She imagined his fury, his certainty that she could not get far in such weather. Perhaps he was right. But distance, even a small one, meant possibility. The storm that caged her might yet hide her. Snow clung to her lashes, froze in her hair, numbed her fingers where they gripped the child's blanket. Yet still she pressed on, step by step, into the endless dark. She did not know where the road was, where safety might lie, or if morning would ever break through the clouds. All she knew was that she was moving, that the barn and its dangers were behind her, and that her refusal had taken form in the only way left. Flight into the snow, carrying the baby who would not let go of the truth. The storm drove her forward until the town was nothing but a blur behind her, a memory swallowed by snow. Her boots sank deeper with every step, her legs trembling under the weight of exhaustion, and the child pressed close against her chest. She had no sense of direction, only the instinct to keep moving, to put as much distance as she could between herself and the barn where the sheriff had lingered. The wind cut sideways, lashing her face until her skin burned with cold, and her eyes stung with tears that froze before they could fall. Then the sound reached her, low at first, buried under the howl of the storm, but growing steadily louder. A roar, deep and constant, unlike the voice of the wind. She knew it before she saw it. The river, the ground dipped beneath her feet, the slope treacherous and hidden by drifts. She nearly stumbled as the snow gave way, sliding toward the faint outline of a bridge half buried under ice. The river churned below, its surface fractured and angry, black water cutting through banks of white. It moved with a force that seemed impossible in such cold, waves breaking against ice floes that cracked and ground against one another. She drew back instinctively, clutching the baby tighter, her breath catching. One misstep, one slip, and the current would claim them both. The bridge loomed ahead, narrow and old, its wooden planks coated in a thick layer of snow. The railings were splintered, sections missing where rot had long ago eaten through. The storm pressed hard against her, urging her toward the crossing, but her body faltered. To step onto it meant trust in something fragile, something as worn and uncertain as herself. She looked down at her child, his face barely visible beneath the folds of blanket, his fists still curled stubbornly around what he carried. His small chest rose and fell in steady breaths, untouched by the fear that gripped her. She pulled the blanket higher around him, shielding him from the flakes that stung her cheeks, and forced her feet forward. The first plank groaned under her weight, snow shifting to reveal what's slick with ice. She gripped the rail where it still stood, her hand raw against the splinters, and took another step. The river's roar grew louder with every pace, filling her ears until it drowned even the wind. She fixed her gaze ahead, refusing to look down into the dark water that surged beneath her. Halfway across, the storm blinded her completely. Snow blew sideways, a white wall that erased the far end of the bridge, leaving her stranded in a world where only the roar below reminded her of the danger waiting. She bent her head low, pressing her cheek to her child's crown, and whispered words he could not hear. Each step became a prayer, each plank beneath her boots a fragile promise that might give way at any moment. The bridge swayed slightly, the old timbers bending against the wind. She clung tighter to the railing, her breath ragged, and pressed forward one step, then another. The storm clawed at her from every side. Yet she kept moving, the thought of turning back more terrifying than what lay ahead. Behind her was the sheriff, the ledger, the life she had been cast out of. Before her was only the unknown, the path erased by snow, but it was hers to claim. When at last her boots found solid ground again, she nearly fell to her knees. The far bank rose steeply, the river still snarling behind her, but she was across. She pressed on, the baby warm against her chest, his small hand still gripping tightly, and let the storm swallow the bridge until it was only a memory. The storm had nearly erased the world, smothering every sound but the wind and the roar of the river now behind her. Each step forward felt stolen, her boots sinking deep into drifts that threatened to hold her fast. The baby's weight grew heavier in her arms, though she clutched him tighter, whispering words she could not even hear over the gale. Her body bent low, shoulders hunched, head bowed against the blinding snow. She wondered if there was anywhere left to go but down into the storm itself. Then a light flickered through the white, a glow that did not belong to the sky or the storm. At first she thought it a trick, her eyes so stung by cold they must have conjured it. But the glow steadied, then swayed gently, bobbing as though carried by a hand. She stopped, her breath caught in her throat, half ready to turn back into the storm rather than face another danger. The glow came closer, and with it the outline of a man. He moved slowly, deliberately, the lantern lifted high to cut through the swirling snow. His coat was heavy and long, the fur at its collar dusted white, and his boots crunched steadily as he advanced. Easy there, his voice carried, firm but even, no trace of command in it. Storm's got teeth tonight. You'll freeze if you keep wandering. She stood rooted, her arms tightening around the child, every muscle taut with suspicion. The sheriff's knock still rang in her ears, his false promises, his lurking presence outside the barn. Men who offer help often carried another weight beneath their words, and she had been betrayed enough to know better than to trust easily. The man seemed to read her hesitation, for he stopped a few paces away, holding the lantern so its glow fell across his lined face. He was older, his features worn by years, but his eyes held steady, not darting, not calculating. "Got a cabin just ahead," he said, his breath turning to smoke in the air. "Fire's still burning. You and the little one need it more than I do. Don't answer now, just follow if you choose." He lowered the lantern slightly, not pushing forward, not crowding her. It was a restraint more than the words that made her pause. She glanced down at the baby, whose cheeks were flushed in the cold, whose fists still clutched the bundle hidden beneath the blanket. The child's eyelids fluttered but did not open, and she knew his small body could not bear much more of the storm. She shifted her weight, testing the thought of stepping closer to the stranger. Her heart pounded, torn between fear and necessity. The sheriff could still be near, his eyes watching from the storm, waiting for her to falter. But here stood another choice, a light, a voice that carried no threat. She could not yet call it trust, but it was something her weary body could not ignore. The man took one step back, opening the space between them further. "Your choice, miss," he said simply, "but I'll walk slow. If you follow, you'll find warmth. If not, well, may the storm spare you." He turned slightly, the lantern swaying, casting long shadows across the snow. She hesitated a moment longer, then lifted her boot, sinking it into the drift in his direction. The baby stirred, as though sensing her decision, and she whispered into the storm, "Hold on." Step by step, she began to follow the glow, the stranger's hand steady ahead, leading her into whatever lay beyond the blizzard's reach. The cabin stood where the pines pressed thick against one another, their snow-laden branches bowing under the weight of the storm. The stranger led her to the door, lantern swinging low, his boots leaving a sure trail through the drifts. He said little, only glanced back once to be sure she followed, his face unreadable in the glow. When he pushed open the door, a wash of warm air spilled out, carrying the scent of smoke and wood resin. She stepped inside hesitantly. The baby clutched close, blinking against a sudden shift from biting cold to gentle heat. The interior was modest, rough-hewn logs, a small stove glowing orange in a corner, a table marked with knife scores, a bed made up with thick quilts. The stranger set the lantern down and added a log to the fire, coaxing the flames higher. The crackle filled the silence, a sound so ordinary it startled her after hours of storm and fear. He gestured toward the chair nearest the stove. "Sit," warmed the little one first. His voice carried no weight of command, only simple instruction, the kind spoken by someone accustomed to solitude. She lowered herself into the chair, her legs trembling from the strain of walking. Heat licked at her boots, seeped slowly into her stiff fingers. She unwrapped the baby's blanket, just enough to let his face feel the warmth. His cheeks were flushed, his lips a pale pink, his tiny chest rising in steady breaths. Relief swept through her so sharp it nearly broke her. She pressed her lips to his forehead, whispering thanks he could not hear, then tucked the blanket close again, careful to keep the bundle hidden within. The stranger poured hot water from a kettle into a chipped mug, set it on the table, and turned away as though to give her space. His silence allowed her thoughts to gather. The fire's glow felt almost like safety, but it was temporary, fragile, like the thin walls of the barn before. She knew the sheriff had not given up. Somewhere in the white night he was still waiting, his promise of safe escort hanging like a snare. If he reached the cabin, if he knocked again, warmth would not shield her. Her gaze fell to the bundle in her child's hands. He had not let it go, even through the crossing, the stranger's light, the storm's fury. She hesitated, then gently eased it from his grasp, feeling his tiny fingers twitch in protest before he settled back into sleep. She set the bundle on her lap, unwrapping the cloth carefully, her movements slow, reverent, as though each fold carried weight. The ledger's leather cover gleamed dully in the firelight. Scarred with years of use, edges softened where her husband's hand had turned them countless times. She opened it once more. The ink was dark, the pages crowded with names and numbers, symbols that carried meanings she could not fully grasp. Here in the glow of the stove, she read further than she had dared before. Transactions stretched back years, some marked with dates she remembered well. Nights her husband had been gone late, excuses given too quickly. She saw the sheriff's name repeated, sums growing larger with time. She saw the pastor's initials, the banker's careful letters, officials from beyond the town whose faces she only half recognized. It was not merely local corruption. It was a chain, each link bound by the ink on these pages. Her hands shook as she traced the lines, anger stirring beneath her exhaustion. The ledger was more than evidence. It was a map of deceit, a record of power that had hidden itself beneath sermons, badges, and handshakes. Her husband had been its keeper, but not its master. He was one among many, and now, through chance or providence, the book rested in her lap. The stranger cleared his throat softly, as though reminding her he was still there, but he did not ask about the book. He busied himself at the stove, his back turned, leaving her to the firelight and the ink. She closed the ledger slowly, sliding it back into cloth, and returned it to her baby's grip. His fingers closed around it instinctively, as though it had always belonged to him. She drew the blanket over him once more, her choice silent but sure. The storm raged beyond the cabin walls, but here in the warmth, she held a fragile moment of stillness. Her heart knew it would not last. But for now, she allowed herself the smallest breath of ease, knowing the ledger was safe in her child's hands and that the fire would hold until morning. The fire had burned low, logs settling into embers that pulsed red and gold. The baby slept soundly now, the faintest summer breath rising from his tiny chest. She sat close to the stove, her body half turned as though to shield him from the stranger who moved about the room in quiet, measured steps. He had given her food, a cup of broth that warmed her hands, and then lapsed into silence, respecting the space between them. But she felt his eyes on her still, not prying, not hostile, simply waiting. At last he spoke, his voice low, almost hesitant. "That book," he said, his gaze fixed on a cloth-wrapped bundle in her baby's hands. "You opened it. I saw the way you looked at it, like you were reading words you weren't meant to see." She stiffened, her arms drawing closer around the child. The instinct to hide, to deny, rose sharp in her chest. Yet there was no malice in his tone, only a gravity that told her he already knew enough. She hesitated, then drew the cloth back once more, revealing the leather-bound ledger. The firelight caught its surface, casting a dull gleam across its scarred cover. She laid it gently on the table between them, her fingers reluctant to let go. The stranger lowered himself into the chair opposite her. He did not reach for the book at once, but sat still, as though bracing himself for what it contained. When he finally opened it, the crack of the spine seemed louder than the storm beyond the walls. His eyes swept the pages with focus that unsettled her. He did not read as one confused or guessing. He read as though he understood. Names flickered in the firelight as he turned the pages. His expression tightened, his jaw set, until at last he stopped on a line marked with symbols she had not been able to decipher. His lips pressed into a hard line. "So it's true," he muttered, more to himself than to her. He looked up, his gaze meeting hers, sharp and urgent now. "Do you know what these are? These codes." She shook her head slowly. "Only that they're tied to the men in town. Men with power, my husband among them." The stranger tapped the page, his finger pressing against the ink. "This isn't just coin changing hands. These marks, these are shipments, routes, quiet trade that moves where it shouldn't. And these numbers," he exhaled sharply, the sound heavy with dread. "These aren't small debts. They're accounts tied to men far beyond this town. Men who bury their tracks in ledgers like this. Men who would kill 10 times over to make sure no one else sees them." Her blood ran cold. The room seemed smaller now, the walls pressing in. "You're saying they'll come for it." "They'll come for you," he corrected, his voice steady but unflinching. "Because right now you're not just a woman cast out. You're the one holding proof. Proof that could topple more than one household. Proof that could unravel a chain they spent years tightening." The baby stirred, shifting in her arms, and she pulled him closer, her hand resting over his small fist still curled around the cloth. The stranger's eyes softened as they fell on the child, but his words did not. "That book is dangerous, and as long as it's in your keeping, so are you." Silence stretched between them, filled only by the pop of the fire and the storm claw at the cabin walls. She understood now what she had not before. The sheriff's knock was not merely threat, not merely cruelty. It was desperation, the kind born from knowing one book could undo everything he had built. The stranger closed the ledger carefully, his hands lingering on the cover before sliding it back across the table. "Don't let it go," he said firmly. "Not to him. Not to any of them. Men would kill to bury these pages. And if they think you'll give it up, they'll hound you until the snow itself runs red." She swallowed hard, her throat dry, her fears sharpened into something colder, steadier. The firelight flickered across her child's face, and she knew then that the weight of the ledger was not hers alone. It had passed to her, yes, but it would shape the life of the one who carried it in his small hands. She whispered to herself, though perhaps to the stranger too, "Then we must keep moving." The storm roared louder, as though in answer, but her voice did not tremble. The stranger leaned back, his expression grim but resolute, and in his silence she understood he would not stop her. He knew, as she did now, that what lay within those pages was too dangerous to surrender, and too powerful to let vanish into the dark. The fire had settled into a low crackle, its warmth softening the sting of the storm still raging beyond the walls. She sat in the chair nearest the stove, the baby nestled against her chest, the bundle hidden as always in the folds of his blanket. Across from her, the stranger leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames as though searching for answers there. The quiet was uneasy, but it carried a fragile comfort after so many hours of wind and fear. For a moment she allowed herself to believe the night might pass without intrusion. Then came the knock. It was sharp, deliberate, a sound that cut to the crackle of the fire and the low moan of the wind. Her body stiffened instantly, her arms tightening around the child. The stranger's head lifted, his expression hardening in an instant. The knock came again, heavier this time, rattling the wooden door in its frame. And beneath it, faint but undeniable, was the crunch of boots in snow. Not one pair, several. Her breath caught, the sound sticking in her throat. She looked at the stranger, his face now set in grim lines, the lantern glow catching the scar along his cheek. He did not move at first, as though calculating. The boots shifted outside, snow scattering against the threshold. A voice rose above the storm, muffled but strong enough to carry. "Open up. Sheriff's orders." Her blood turned cold. The sheriff had not given up, had not retreated to wait for morning as she had hoped. He had brought others. She could picture them now. Deputies, perhaps even some of the very men whose names filled the ledger. They would come in force, cloaked not only in the storm but in authority, ready to drag her back into silence. The baby stirred at the sound, a small whimper pressing against her chest. She rocked him quickly, whispering shushing sounds that trembled with her fear. The stranger rose slowly from his chair, every movement measured, his shadow stretching long across the wall. He gestured with one hand for her to stay still. His eyes locked on the door as the knocking grew louder, more insistent. "We know she's in there," another voice called, this one sharper, younger, carrying less patience. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be. Hand her over and there'll be no trouble." Her arms clutched the baby tighter, her heart hammering so hard she thought it might betray her through the walls. Trouble had already arrived. She knew, too, well, there was no promise of safety in those words, only the certainty of being stripped of the book and left to whatever fate they decided fit her. The stranger moved to the stove, lifted the poker, and rested it against the wall within reach. His face was calm, but his eyes burned with steadiness that unsettled her. He did not look at her, but his voice was low, steady. "They won't stop with a knock. Be ready." The boots shifted again, circling the cabin just as they had circled the barn before. Snow crunched in heavy rhythms, men spreading out, testing the walls with their presence. The knock turned to pounding, the door groaning under fists and shoulders. The baby whimpered again, and she bent her head low, whispering into his curls, her words half prayer, half promise. The fire hissed as a log collapsed into embers. The storm howled against the pines, and in the dim glow of the cabin, she felt the walls tremble as the night outside pressed closer, carrying with it not just the storm, but the men who would stop at nothing to bury the truth her child carried in his hands. The pounding on the door shook the cabin, each strike echoing through the beams as though the storm itself had turned to fists. The voices outside barked orders, threats wrapped in the weight of authority. The stranger stood at the ready, his shoulders squared, the iron poker leaning in his hand like a weapon meant for more than tending fire. She huddled deeper into the chair, her baby pressed against her chest, her arms forming a shield as if her body alone could stand against the men outside. Through the chaos, the shouts, the wood straining in its frame, the storm clawing at the windows, the baby remained unshaken. His tiny fists, curled since the night began, still gripped the cloth bundle. Even in his sleep, his fingers refused to release it. She looked down at him, her breath ragged, and saw how tightly the hand clutched, knuckles paling against the strain. It was not chance anymore, not mere instinct. It felt deliberate, as though the child himself had chosen to guard what others would kill to reclaim. The stranger's eyes flicked toward her, then downward to the bundle. He noticed. She saw it in the brief lift of his brow, the flicker of something that might have been awe or disbelief. He did not speak, not with the boots circling outside, but she understood the question in his glance. How could child, so new to the world, hold fast to a weight so heavy? She had no answer, only the knowledge that this grip was stronger than hers had ever been. She had tried to hide the ledger in corners, to bury it in folds of straw, but every place felt temporary, fragile. Yet in her child's hands, it seemed immovable. The pounding grew harsher, a voice barking, "Last chance! Open or we break it down." She pressed her lips to her son's crown, her tears hot against the cold skin of his forehead. "Hold on," she whispered, not sure she spoke to him or herself. The baby stirred but did not wake, his hand tightening further around the book. It was as if he heard, as if some quiet will rose inside him to answer her plea. The stranger stepped closer to the door, the lantern throwing his shadow across the floorboards, tall and steady. The baby shifted again, a small sigh leaving his lips, but his grip never loosened. She slid her palm over his tiny fist, feeling the firmness of his hold, the way his skin pressed into the leather beneath. The ledger seemed less like an object now and more like an inheritance, something the child had claimed before she ever realized what it was. The door shook under the weight of shoulders, slamming against it. Snow sifted down from the rafters with each blow. Her body trembled with fear, but when she looked down at the small hand still curled in defiance, a steadiness flickered within her. Perhaps it was not hers to guard at all. Perhaps it had always been meant for him. She rocked gently, whispering words a storm could not carry. "Don't let go." The baby breathed evenly, his fist unrelenting, and she knew with certainty that unsettled her, that even if the door splintered, even if the sheriff himself stepped into the cabin, her child would not release it. Truth, fragile and dangerous, was safer in the smallest hands than in any hiding place she could ever choose. The night stretched long, each hour heavier than the one before. The storm outside had not broken, but its fury had dulled, the wind no longer clawing so violently at the cabin walls. Instead, there was a quiet rhythm to it now, as though even the sky was holding its breath, waiting for the moment when dawn would finally arrive. Inside, the fire burned low, its embers glowing faint red, painting the room in the color of decision. She sat in the chair nearest the stove, her baby in her arms, his fist still wrapped around a cloth bundle, as though it were his alone to keep. The voices outside had fallen silent. No more pounding on the door, no more boots circling the walls. The stranger had warned her not to trust the quiet. Men like the sheriff did not leave. They watched, they waited, they let fear do its slow work. She felt that truth settle in her chest, a weight almost as heavy as the ledger itself. When dawn came, they would try again, perhaps harder, perhaps with fire instead of fists, perhaps with the law itself as their weapon. She had the hours until then to choose. Her eyes drifted to the bundle. She could keep running. The storm might cover her tracks. The river had already put distance between her and the town. If she left before sunrise, with a stranger's help or alone, she might vanish into the white world beyond the pines. She could raise her child far from here. Let the ledger remain only a memory of danger narrowly escaped. Survival whispered to her in that path, tempting her with the thought of safety, of silence, of a life rebuilt somewhere no one knew her name. And yet the other choice pressed harder. The pages she had seen, the sheriff's name written again and again, the banker, the pastor, the councilman, all tied together by ink her husband had carried like scripture. She had seen their corruption in plain lines, their alliances hidden under sermons and uniforms. If she revealed the ledger, if she placed in the hands of someone who could not be silenced, their power would unravel. The same men who had turned their faces from her, who had cast her out and hoped the snow would bury her, would fall. The thought lit a fire in her chest, quiet but fierce. To reveal it meant danger, perhaps death, but it also meant truth. The stranger sat across the room, silent, watching her with eyes that seemed to know the weight of her struggle. He had not pressed her, had not told her what she must do, but she sensed he understood the codes, the reach of the ledger, the kind of men who had everything to lose. His presence was both a comfort and a reminder. She was not imagining the danger. It was real, sharp, and closing in. She looked down at her baby, at his small hand clinging stubbornly even in sleep. He had refused to let go since the moment they stepped into the snow, his grip unyielding where hers had faltered. It was as if he knew, in some instinct deeper than memory, that what he held was not just paper, but the truth itself. She pressed her lips to his forehead and let the warmth of him steady her. The hours crept toward morning. The storm eased further, the gray outline of pines beginning to sharpen against the thinning dark. Soon the sun would rise, and with it would come the men waiting outside, their patience stretched, their violence ready. She would have no more time for hesitation then. She closed her eyes, breathing slowly, and felt the choice burn itself into her. To keep running and save only herself and her child, or to step into light of dawn carrying the ledger high, ready to expose everything and bring down the men who had tried to erase her. The fire hissed as another log collapsed into embers. The cabin seemed to hold its silence with her, listening, as though it too awaited her answer. She opened her eyes and whispered into the dim room, more to herself than anyone else. "Before the sun rises, I will know." Her voice trembled but did not break. For the first time since the door slammed behind her, she felt the stirrings of choice, not only of survival. Dawn would demand it, and when it came, she would not turn away.